everyone in the 5 minutes. Do all the speakers know? Okay. Morning, everyone. Oh, clearly not hard enough. Morning, everyone. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for coming today. It's lovely to see you all here. Hope those that went out last night are feeling suitably refreshed this morning. We've tried to keep it quite dim for those that went out late last night. Right, we've got a really packed agenda as always. So we've got some housekeeping information. If you could all read that while I'm talking to you, please. All of the CLS staff have got coloured lanyards, so if anyone's got any issues, do get in touch with us throughout the day. Want a specific thanks to our funders who supported us the day-to-day, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and also Scottish Government, and also thanks to the Scottish Community Alliance who helped us with the study visits yesterday. The hashtag for the event today, if anyone wants to tweet, is hashtag CommunityLand22. And we'll be taking photos throughout the day. So if you really don't want your photo taken, then do let any of the staff members know and we'll make sure you're not included in that. We're also live streaming part of the event, which is this microphone here. So if all the speakers could speak to the room and speak to that microphone, that would be great. And I think that's all my instructions. There's a map in the delegate pack, and we've got a couple of exhibitions. There's a mini Year of Community Ownership exhibition in the Salisbury room, which is near where the exhibitors are, and the Centro where you get your coffees. And then there's also a quiet room if anyone needs any time to do any work on a Saturday. The Duddingston room, that's a quiet room apart from when the surgeries are taking place. So we're going to kick off with the first set of presentations. So we've got some presentations this morning and then a panel discussion. And I'm really pleased to introduce Harry Whitmore. Harry is from the Mull and Iona Community Trust, and he's our new face of community ownership. So, Harry.
Hi. So I wouldn't go as far as to say I'm the new face of community ownership, but I have just started. So I'm Harry Whitmore. I work at the Mull and Iona Community Trust, and I'm there on a one-year placement as a recent graduate at the University of Edinburgh, working as a graduate data researcher for the Trust, doing all sorts of research projects. So I'm here to talk about partly some of the work that we're doing at the Mull and Iona Community Trust, but also about my experiences as a young person working in community land ownership, and some ideas amongst myself and my peers about some good ideas to maybe improve some stuff and what's going well and all that kind of stuff. So just quickly, Mull and Iona Community Trust, who we are and what we do. So we were established 25 years ago, it's our 25th birthday this year, to deliver all sorts of community-minded projects across the islands of Mull and Iona. We currently have 25 staff on payroll, 13 full-time employees, so we're quite a large organisation when it comes to a community development trust. Our current activities include things like several charity shops across the island, recycling facilities, affordable housing, community transportation, marine pontoons, a countryside ranger service, renewable energy, the promotion of electric vehicles, public access defibrillators, and advocacy for the local community, including hosting a recent hustings for the Community Council. So these are some of the projects I wanted to draw attention to quickly. One of them, first off, we have the Ulva Ferry pontoons, which were created in 2016, I believe, maybe 2017. And they support lots of water-based businesses, such as tours to the islands of Staffa and Lunga from Ulva Ferry, which is on the northwest side of the island, and there's a small settlement there. We have Ardura Forest, which was purchased in 2019, and that has several functions as well. Some of that's commercial forestry, some of that's now native woodland, and some of that's sort of community-oriented activities, such as mindfulness sessions, so making the best use of our natural capital on the island. And then we have community transportation, which serves a lot of the most remote areas on Mull and Iona and helps people who may have mobility difficulties to access various parts of the island. And during COVID-19, we ran a service delivering food to vulnerable households or ones who didn't have access to a lot of travel during lockdowns. So at university, I studied architecture, and now I'm doing data and living on the Isle of Mull. So I get asked quite a lot, including yesterday, how did an architecture student from Brighton end up on Mull? And the answer is the Ulva Ferry Housing Project. So I researched this as part of my dissertation, and it's what got me quite significantly into community ownership. And this is one housing project, phase 1 and 2, in the Ulva Ferry community, where the school was in the start of the 2010s was under threat of closure due to a low number of students. So the school association got together with ourselves at the Mull and Iona Community Trust and built a number of housing. It was 6 houses in total by the end of phase 1 and 2 to help reverse that kind of those population issues and bring younger families with young children into the community. So these projects won a number of awards, including Surf Housing Awards and Chartered Institute of Housing Awards as well. So that was built to very high ecological standards, I'll add as well, which was part of the reason I was interested in the project. So that's some of the work we've been doing at the Mull and Iona Community Trust. Now, what I do, because I've been asked to talk about it, is I work providing data for a lot of community organisations on the island, not just myself, but I'm compiling this data book essentially with lots of different issues such as housing, population, electric vehicles, which is a big one we've had at the moment, school roles, all this kind of stuff, which a lot of the smaller community organisations on the island may not have the resources to kind of research themselves all the time, especially when it's much harder to access data. So I'm creating a resource for everyone on the island, essentially, and helping out with individual projects as they come along. But what's really exciting about the role is, although I don't come from a data background myself, what it allows is a really exciting way to learn about all the different nuts and bolts of how community organisations work. This is my first kind of job post-university, and I got into community land ownership because I want to pursue that further. However, it's hard to know how these organisations work and how exactly you get funding and what information is needed and who you access. So these kind of broad general roles for younger people to assist on these parts of things are a really great entry point to the industry and allow us to get to know and go off in different directions which might be more suited to our specific skills. So this is an example of something I've done recently. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it, but for a project which I'll kind of keep under wraps a little bit, we were researching the EV use on the island in terms of the amount of energy used and the number of EVs proportional to the rest of Scotland. So on Mull and Iona, we have 2.8% electric vehicles of all the total vehicles on the island, compared to the Scottish average of 1.1%, which is significantly higher, over double. And you can see here as well on this, during the tourist season, so through spring and summertime, the amount of energy consumed by our charging points increases massively, by however many times that is. I can't remember off the top of my head. But so with all this kind of knowledge, it helps us support the argument that we need more support for electric vehicles on the island. And being a part of that process makes you understand for further projects you might do in your career, what kind of information is necessary. So I'm not the only young person, recent graduate working in community land ownership. We have a little network going on that was put together by Community Land Scotland, and we recently had a graduate network trip to Mull and Iona. So that's a little photo from all of us there. You can spot Linsay and Meg. And so there's about 10 of us in total from all sorts of different community trusts under the ScotGrad scheme, where they support 75% of the funding for young people, recent graduates, for all sorts of different businesses, but Community Development Trust is one of them. So we're from it's mainly based in, obviously, because it's funded by HIE, so it's based in the Highlands and Islands. So we've got people from Tiree, somewhere near Dundoon, I think. I'm blanking on that now, but from a lot of different locations. And so we all got together and we were thinking, I was asked to do this talk about young people and how to bring more young people in. So we got together and came up with a bunch of different ideas about what would be great ways to get people involved. So we have two main things. We have points of entry and sustaining and retaining young people. So in terms of points of entry, some ideas about how to get more people involved were brought down to raising awareness and creating opportunities. So raising awareness was much more to do with at the stage where you're studying or you're in your local community doing whatever, and you might be wanting to get involved with community stuff. How can you draw people in? So one effective method, which was done by the Scottish Land Commission, was the Scottish Land Commission National Student Award, which is an opportunity for students to do some research on community land ownership to some degree. And there's funding to support that, and that helps them understand more about the subject and draw people in. So if there's other organisations with those sorts of ideas with the opportunity to offer things like that, we think that'd be an excellent way to get more young people at the education stage. And so another way at that point in your time was collaborations with similar-minded organisations, which you might not necessarily immediately think have much to do with community land. So one of them, which I've been a part of while I was at university, is the Scottish Ecological Design Association, who have recently launched their Cedar Land project, which I'll be doing some writing for shortly. And so that's drawing on issues of ecological design and land ownership and land use, two fields which I believe are extremely interlinked, and more connections between the two are extremely important, and especially in terms of getting young people on board who may already have links to Cedar. And then obviously as well, there's volunteering opportunities at different development trusts, which varies from where you go. Some have a lot of those opportunities, some don't have so many, but creating volunteering opportunities for young people who are interested in community ownership but don't quite know how to get on board and have some time to spare, maybe students, all that kind of stuff. So the other thing we were thinking about is creating opportunities, because once you've got young people interested, you can't volunteer or do little kind of part-time organisations forever. You need to earn a living, and if you want to get young people to get into community ownership as a career and keep going, there needs to be on-ramps for that. And so I've massively oversimplified it and talked about the fields of umbrellas in the industry and anchors in the industry. So anchors talking about locally based community organisations, might be operating in a smaller area, might have those volunteering opportunities that are very important. I'm sure you know all the organisations that I'm thinking of, but something like Mix might be one of them where I work. And so and then there's the umbrella organisations, which are some of the broader ones, so a lot of the Community Land Scotland stuff. I won't name any other names, but the main point being that there needs to be on-ramps at both of these areas to get young people involved, because it can be quite intimidating coming from, I'm from Brighton. I lived in Edinburgh for a number of years, and I had no connection to Mull to begin with. I only knew about it through some research I'd done and people I'd met. So if you have no connection to the local area or any specific community trust, but you come about it through your academic career and you want to get involved more and you want to learn more about it and you want to work for these opportunities, going to a community development trust can be quite daunting. So providing those opportunities, whether it's similar one-year placements under the ScotGrad scheme, which is what all of us at these anchor institutions across the Highlands and Islands have been doing, for these umbrella organisations, even if it's a similar sort of research role that I'm doing, would be a really great opportunity to get young people who work, who are looking for work after graduating from university or something similar, to get involved more broadly before they feel ready to commit to a specific area and a specific trust and learn more about the wider industry. So yeah, both of those are required to, I think, attract all sorts of people, both people with local connections to communities, which is extremely important, and people who maybe don't have those connections but want to help anyway. And then the next point, just quickly, is sustaining and retaining. So this can be a bit quicker because it's a lot of problems we all face anyway. There's a massive decline of young people in the Highlands and Islands, in rural communities in general, and on Mull and Iona we've seen a 25% decrease in people aged 20 to 29 in the last 10 years, which is extremely significant. So we were talking about problems which are stopping us from maybe staying in these areas, and these are the things that were discussed yesterday in part of the repopulation and accident seminar, and it's stuff that I'm sure all of you face working in the third sector as well, those of you who do, and that's, you know, opportunities for longer funding periods and contracts, proper accommodation for us to live at, different types of tenure so you don't have to commit to buying a house when you don't know if you're going to have a job in a year's time, or so for long-term lets, for example. And then tackling broader issues surrounding keeping young people in the community, such as transportation and access to cultural activities to do, and ways to onboard people to get more involved with community activities. So yes, that's what we came up with. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the conference.
Thank you, Harry. That's a great way to kick off, and I think you'll find that's a bit of a theme today about young people, trying to engage more young people in the sector, and how we can do that together. So next we've got a presentation on a big project coming up for Community Land Scotland, the Year of Community Ownership. I'm not going to give away what that's all about, so I'll pass over to Linsay, Chalmers, our development manager, and Lucy Conway from the Isle of Eigg, who together with Leslie Young, who is here, sitting there, are working on the project for us. So I'll pass you over to Linsay and Lucy. Thank you.
So I'm here to tell you why we want to make 2023 the Year of Community Ownership. At Community Land Scotland, like our members, we like to think big. And we know within our membership we've got some really amazing stories that should be told better. Before COVID happened, a large part of my job was going around the country, attending village hall and town hall meetings and hearing amazing stories from people about their place, about the history of their place, and about their hopes for the future in young people. I always ended up crying at the end of them because it's such an emotional thing to hear. And we know that every community buyout tends to be quite an epic tale with highs and lows along the way. The Isle of Eigg is possibly the most epic and well-known of community stories, but every community has a similar journey. Even in my community, when we bought a community shop, it was a real roller coaster ride. Sleepless nights, elation, people saying it was the best experience of their life. Every emotion was there. And our solicitor said, it was so dramatic he thought a Hollywood film was going to be made one day, and could we just put a word in for him because he really wanted to be played by Daniel Craig, so you can wait for that blockbuster film to come out. But what happens after a community buyout when communities own the land and buildings is an even more powerful story, but one that is not told nearly as often. So when lockdown happened at Community Land Scotland, it gave us a great opportunity to spend some time doing some slightly different projects. And we were able to run lots of different creative projects over a couple of years, working with lots of communities, particularly communities that owned land for quite a long time. And at the end of that, we had a huge array of different materials. We had films, we had maps, including Julia from Kayak's map, which takes up the entire size of their village hall. We had photos, we had walking sticks made by children in a Brecon Forest Trust from the wood in the trust that were then gifted to the founders of the forest, which was bought out over 20 years ago. And we also had bronze casts of peat from Galson Estate. You can see photos of these in the travelling exhibition room. And it's very high-tech peat because it's got a QR code in it, and you can scan it and the peat will talk to you. You'll hear the voices of people on Galson Estate talking about the history of their place. So by the end of this process, we had a lot of really different materials, and we wanted to share the stories that we'd captured, and we didn't really know how to do that. So we decided then we'd commission Lucy and Leslie, who are here today, to have a think about that on our behalf. And they came up with the idea of the Year of Community Ownership. So next year is 100 years since the Stornoway Trust got its land. Next year is also the year of the next Land Reform Act. So next year is the year to make a big fuss about how amazing community ownership is. So we got Lucy and Leslie on board to help us think it through. Lucy's going to talk you through a bit more detail, but can I encourage you to go into the Salisbury room at some point, sign up if you're interested in hearing more, tell us your ideas for the Year of Community Ownership. We'd love to hear them. We're also running a workshop today as well, so a lot of people have signed up for that, so we're really interested to get your feedback about the whole idea. I'm going to hand over to Lucy now.
Hello. Right. I'm Lucy and I'm from Eigg. And as Linsay said, myself and my colleague Leslie have been working on this idea of the year of community ownership. We all, the people in this room, understand what community ownership is and why it's so important to either your individual communities or the Scotland as a whole. And I think the idea of the year of community ownership is to offer an opportunity to celebrate and inspire, but also provoke people into thinking about why it's important. And I don't know about the other organisations which are here who are community owned, but we spend so much time on Eigg with our noses to the grindstone, getting on with it. We forget quite how much we've achieved over the 25 years since the island was first taken into community ownership. And I think that our story is replicated across the whole of Scotland because everybody's experience is related to the whys and the hows that they decided to take on their whatever it is, whether it's a piece of land or a building, but there's something they're passionate about that they feel makes a change to their world. This is a picture that I wanted to share, which is a sort of reflection of what my story that I want to tell you. And the picture on the right was taken in 1996, which is the launch of the Let's Crack It appeal, which was the real start to try and get people to back the Let's Crack It Eigg appeal to buy the island, which happened in 1997. And the wee girl in the front is Frances, looking very serious. It's a serious business, buying an island. And she was about 8 at the time, and her cousin, there's a few cousins in there and a few other folk who are still on the island, whether as they grew up as children or their parents or grandparents or whatever. On the left-hand side here, at the bottom, that's Frances in the background, and she's now grown up. She's now the practice manager of the health surgery on Eigg. She has 2 children of her own. One who is Ross. I think he's 2, and his older brother is about 6. As well as being the practice manager, she and her husband, just before lockdown started, decided to create an oyster farm. And so 3 years later, they've literally just sold their first oysters. She lives in a house that was renovated by the Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust. And so when you look at the progression, and there are other children in that first picture, and that's what community ownership does. It means that the children who sat there in 1996 and didn't understand what their parents or their grandparents were talking about, actually a future was made for them. And the population of Eigg was around 65 in 1996, and now it's just over 110. Lots of those original families are still there. New people have come to Eigg. New babies have been born. People have passed on. But nevertheless, the island is growing and thriving. And although a lot of it's about the infrastructure, actually the main impact is about the people and what has changed and the environment of the people. And I think that's what the Year of Community Ownership offers, which is a chance to tell the story of community ownership and why it's important. And so what we're doing with Community Land Scotland is there's a steering group, an internal steering group, but we're also using events like today's workshop to draw out ideas of the stories that you want to tell, but also how we want to tell these stories. Whether it to be young people, to people who maybe have never heard of community ownership before. There are many people who don't know, don't understand, and are not aware of the sheer impact and power of what it can be achieved. So as well as the stories of your experience that we want to find out about, we also want to understand how you think we should tell them. So we talk about a touring exhibition, and that implies exhibition boards and photographs on walls and so on. But we also want to add in moving image and text and sound. And we want to add in walks, talks, debates, have a website. We want to animate it in some way so that people remember and engage with it at different levels. We want to make it about the young people who are actually, the 8-year-olds of today and the 18-year-olds of today who are going to take forward and in their 25-year lifetime will be able to say that community ownership was an important part of the future that they built with the other people they live with. So please, myself and Leslie, waving gladly to all, and Linsay and myself, please do take a moment to grab us and tell us what you think should happen as part of the year. but also most importantly is how we should tell the story. The idea is it could be a touring exhibition, probably about 6 or 8 venues across Scotland. That will vary, depending on what comes in. But we're really open to ideas at the moment. And all of that feedback and all of that submissions will be put into the inevitable funding application to the Heritage Lottery Fund and other funders, which I hope, of course, why would it not be successful? And so 2023 will be a fantastic year of community ownership. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy and Leslie and Harry. And I'm just going to ask you if you wouldn't mind coming up to the stage for 5 minutes, just if anyone's got any questions about those presentations. I think that there was a lot in there, lots of exciting information. I'm really interested on the Mull story and Harry's take on what it's like living in a rural area. You've come from Brighton, then to Edinburgh, then to Mull. So what do you think are the challenges for a young person moving to a rural area?
Well, definitely. First of all, I must say I love it. Love finding life is great fun. But I think the main challenge for young people is obviously around housing. And housing is an extremely difficult thing to deal in these areas for lots of different people and lots of different demographics. But I think specifically for young people, it's about the tenure. So, if someone's maybe in their 30s and they've maybe moved away and want to come back, not that that's not young. At the start of their career, if you're coming back and you maybe want to start a family, you can buy a house and you can make that kind of commitment. But if you're, just started your career and don't want to go next, and you're running a 1-year contract like yourself, you're not going to buy a place and don't have the money to buy a place. But so having those kind of long-term rental opportunities available, which is what community trusts can really effectively do, and they can do that in an affordable way. And then they can do that in a way which more targets young people, not just family homes.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah, some good points there. And I know the work that you're doing on the housing data set in Mull. Is that something, is that officially out there now? Can you talk a wee bit about some of the main findings from that?
From the housing data?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to recall something. It was a little while ago. Stuff now. But just a quick thing that we've been looking at recently is about the kind of housing to short-term lapse situation. So the number of properties that have gone off the market.
Sorry, can you use the microphone?
Oh yeah, of course I can. Sorry.
People online here at Raeburn. Swing it on. Sorry, that mic's not on yet, but this one will work.
All right, sweet. Thanks very much. So I'll give a little bit of information regarding housing specifically. I want to wait until I've done the whole day, but before I kind of give stuff out completely. But something that we're looking at is the amount of family homes or long-term accommodation that's going to short-term lets. And so I was speaking about the Old Ferry housing project earlier. We built 6 houses there, and 5 houses in the local area have gone from long-term ownership or long-term people living there to now short-term lets. So the actual net, there's only one new house in terms of people living there in terms of net. So we're barely keeping our heads above in terms of these most fragile areas. And on that note, some research with regard to the number of registered short-term lets in the last 5 years. And on Mull and Iona, that's increased by 40%, and it's increased by 20% alone in the last 2 years. So the massive shift from long-term housing to short-term lets is a major problem, not just the building of housing stock, maintaining that housing stock for long-term use.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. And of course that hugely impacts on all sectors of the population, but particularly on young people who say trying to get a foot on the ladder. So Linsay and Lucy, I think you're thinking about the themes for next year, and you're really keen, aren't you, to engage more young people in developing the exhibition and then the audience. So have you given any further thought to that and how that might work?
Can you hear me? It's very strange. I think young people, like I said just now, they are the future of all of our communities. And I think that sometimes when you're as young people, you're moved down to that ground school, it's quite hard to think beyond that community room that you're working in, think beyond that application form that you must get in, or the business plan that you're writing, whatever else. And also
if you're at 95, we will be there telling you all about it.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Harry or Lucy or Linsay? Yeah, Andy.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for your presentation. I was intrigued by your point that you built, built 6 houses, but 5 have gone on short-term lets. Is anyone looking at whether those 5 are legal or not? Was any planning consent applied for them? If not, is anyone taking enforcement action, or is everyone just accepting that this is life?
To be honest, I'm not the housing project officer and don't feel fully qualified to answer that question. I'm not entirely sure my facts there. When we talk about legality, I'm not sure I want to make any claims in that sense. I don't know of any.
But illegal.
Jamie, I don't know, do you want to come in and answer that?
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
I mean, I might pick you up wrong, Harry, but my understanding of what you actually said was 5 other houses in the district
Oh,
have
yeah.
gone short-term lets, not 5 that have been built.
Yes, sorry, I might have been unclear about that, yeah. So our ones are obviously still in community ownership, we still own the 6 houses that we developed, but 5 other ones in the area were sent to short-term lets.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Mary?
Well, it's just that in the other everybody's we've got year of homecoming next year. How, with the council reading on it, how do we marry the two up? Community land ownership and year of homecoming. I think we're hoping to bring Canadians and Americans back.
Well, this is, and this isn't like one of the official Scottish Government year of post-mortars years or something else. I think the idea is we can collaborate with any projects, and I think what's important is it's important to the communities that we're working with is what will be in the year of community ownership. So I don't think there's any reason why there's 2 years of might not combining one in something. But just we replied to Andy's point. We had a house on Eigg recently, which had been a private home, had been the people who had owned it had died and passed it on to relatives, who then used part as a sort of second home and then became a holiday home. During COVID, they then let it out on a temporary longish lease to the local primary school teacher. And then when COVID lifted, they decided they were going to sell it. And of course, we were very concerned that going on the open market, it would just go as a second home or as a holiday home. So by working with the Highland Council, we managed to take it back into not community ownership, but the Highland Council bought it and made it Egg's first council house, if you like, and it's now let to the teacher. And that, I think that from our point of view, was fantastic to be able to work with Highland Council to really reverse a situation that we were all concerned about and make sure that our school teacher had somewhere to live, because otherwise there literally was nowhere else for him to go. So I think that bringing those examples of how community ownership and working in partnership with other initiatives and other organisations can have a really, really positive outcome and change things.
Thanks. Justin, did you want to?
I sort of suggest you have homecoming to community ownership.
Any other questions? No. Well, thank you, Harry and Lucy and Linsay, for those conversations, and then we're going to move on. Thank you. So next we have the launch of a report, Community Wealth Building and a Just Transition to Net Zero. And I'm really pleased to welcome one of the authors, Laurie McFarlane, to present the report to you and then take part in a panel discussion. So Laurie is based in Edinburgh. He's an economist and researcher. He's currently a senior research fellow at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. He's also a fellow at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. This is a really long list, Laurie. An advisor to North Ayrshire Council's Community Wealth Building Expert Group and he's also a member of the Progressive Economy Forum. And prior to all of this, he was a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation, and he's also the co-author of a critically acclaimed book, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing. So I'm going to ask Laurie to present his report to you, and then Callum will be leading a discussion on the report and some of the themes around that. Thanks, Laurie. Okay, so just right click.
Excellent, thank you very much, Ailsa. And yeah, sorry, that was a mouthful. Hello everyone, it's great to be here today, particularly to be participating in our conference in person. It's been a long time since I've been able to do this, particularly great that it's such a nice day. So as Ailsa said, I'm going to be providing a brief overview of a new report that I've co-authored with my colleague Miriam Brett. It's been launched today. I believe it might be online now, or if it's not, it will be very soon. And it's called Community Wealth Building and a Just Transition to Net Zero. Now, the sort of genesis of this work is really that many of you will probably be familiar with the debate around, green lairds that's sort of sprung up over the past year, which has been, quite effective at sort of putting some of these issues on the radar. But we wanted to basically move sort of beyond that sort of high-level, somewhat imprecise debate about green lairds and look in a bit more detail about how carbon, natural capital is transforming Scotland's land market, but also who are the sort of actors that we're talking about. Who are the different operators? What are the different business models? What are their sort of primary motivations? And then also assess the extent to which what's happening on the ground is consistent or not consistent with the Scottish Government's stated policy objectives, particularly around community wealth building, but also just transition. So just taking a step back, obviously there's the big global context here is around the recent global embrace of net zero, both by governments and by businesses. Now, there's obviously two different levers that can be pulled to meet net zero targets. You can reduce your gross emissions. In addition to that, you can also offset them by acquiring carbon credits from activities which reduce or sequester carbon from the atmosphere, things like woodland creation, peatland restoration, etc. And over the course of the past year, but also before that, we've seen a real boom in interest for carbon offsetting, demand for carbon credits. You see on the screen here, this is just a couple of headlines from the financial press just in the past week or two. So this is even since we finished the report. So there really is gathering quite a lot of steam here in terms of investor interest globally. Now, in order to do this, to generate carbon credits, generally you need particularly one thing, and that's land, and quite a lot of it. And this is a global issue. Scotland's not alone in facing these challenges. But Scotland obviously does have particular features, its landmark has particular features which make it particularly attractive to those who are seeking to buy land for carbon offsetting purposes. We have a large rural land area, we have obviously a very highly concentrated pattern of land ownership, a very lightly regulated or largely unregulated land market, and a favourable tax and subsidy regime. And this makes it relatively easy and straightforward for companies or individuals who are looking to acquire large amounts of land easily with very few sort of questions asked. And just briefly, in the report we touch a bit on sort of recent land market activity. The Scottish Land Commission did a very detailed report on this exact sort of question recently, and what we see in the report sort of very much dovetails with that. So I'm not going to talk much about this, but the bottom line is particularly over the course of the past year, we've seen a surge in demand for rural land in Scotland. We've seen prices increase across all types of rural land, and we've also seen off-market sales increase. Now, there's a whole range of different things going on here, supporting Not to Simplify. We have high timber prices, a buoyant forestry sector playing into this. We have supply issues playing into this, but the evidence is pretty clear that the emerging value associated with carbon and natural capital is becoming an increasingly important driver of demand in Scotland's land market. This is something which the Land Commission, but also various others have picked up as well. And as a result of that, we're seeing new types of actors enter the land market in Scotland with the specific purpose of buying land for carbon offsetting purposes. Now, in terms of what's going on here, what's the sort of mechanisms for generating revenue from all of this stuff? There are currently two carbon credit schemes operating in Scotland, the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, And there are also a number of grant schemes available to landowners that are able to access for things like tree planting, peatland restoration, etc. Now, Community Land Scotland published a recent paper by John Hollingdale which sort of looked at this stuff specifically, so it's worth going to have a read at that if you're interested in it. We just touch on it briefly. The one thing I do want to say here, though, is that at the moment we just have the 2 carbon credit schemes, but I think it's possible and perhaps likely that going forward we may have other types of schemes coming online, natural capital markets or payment for ecosystem services, which basically will enable landowners to generate revenue from different sorts of ways to manage ecosystems sustainably, whether that's to do with soil credits, water credits, things like that. In England, they've already introduced the concept of biodiversity net gain into the planning system. This is creating a market for biodiversity credits, which again provides another sort of revenue-generating mechanism for landowners. And if and when that does happen, I think it's reasonable to expect that that could then put further upward pressure on land prices, because in the expectation that there's extra revenue to be generated. Okay, so at the moment, though, carbon credits really is the sort of the main game in town when it comes to this for the time being. And an important question then is, if this is already impacting Scotland's land market, which we think it clearly is, what does the future look like? How could the sort of future evolution of carbon offsetting evolve, and what would be the impact on Scotland's land market? Now, there are obviously the future is very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen in future. We don't know what's going to happen to the price of offsets in the carbon market. There have been a range of different sort of studies done recently by academic institutes, private research houses, various other credible sources, looking at what's going to happen here. How is the price of these things going to evolve? So at the moment we have prices in Scotland's carbon offset market ranging about £15 to £20. And the range of forecasts going forward, there's a wide range, as you can see, reflecting the wide degree of uncertainty. The one thing, though, there is a reasonable degree of consensus, is that the price is going to go up, although the extent to which we don't know. And that blue shaded area just shows the very, very wide range of that. Now, you might say, well, why does that matter? Forecasts are forecasts, they're often wrong, they might not transpire, and that's obviously absolutely true. The reason we think that this is important is because some market actors are taking these forecasts quite seriously, and they're therefore changing their behaviour as a result today, including in cases their sort of investment activity. So, in other words, when it comes to the land market, expectations matter a lot, and the expectations around the evolution of the carbon offset market is sort of feeding back through to activity today. And I'll talk a bit more about a specific example about that just in a minute. Now, the key question then is therefore, if prices do increase like this, this is quite big business. There's already money to be made in this sphere, but if prices increase, obviously that increases dramatically. And if that then also has a knock-on effect, which we think it probably will, onto land values, there's a reasonable, we think it's likely that there's significant amounts of value to be created and potentially, extracted from this area in Scotland. And the key question is, how is that value captured and how is it distributed? And in Scotland, our legal system today says that, the right to exploit natural capital opportunities, to generate carbon credits and to reap the financial rewards will accrue largely to landowners. And obviously any increases in land values will also accrue to landowners today. So, as ever, the question of who owns Scotland's land is absolutely key to the question of how this emerging value of this whole area is going to be distributed throughout and across Scotland. And so that's the question that we then turn to in terms of business models. So I mentioned at the beginning this sort of discussion and debate about green lairds, and what we wanted to do was kind of cut through that a little bit and look at, well, what are the different types of actors that are on the ground just now, and try and have a bit more precision to that. And so we develop a sort of a typology of different types of landowners, different ownership models: corporate landowners, asset manager landowners, charity NGO landowners, mass ownership, individual and community ownership. Now, all these should probably be, I think, self-explanatory. We do explain them in the paper. The one that might not be is the mass ownership one. This is fairly new. It's not something that's particularly prevalent, but there is an effort at the moment to kind of get that going, so we thought it was important to include it. So we delve into that a bit more in the paper. So the next thing that we do, we look at a case study for each of these different types of models, a specific case study, and then we look at, well, what are they actually doing? What's their sort of primary activities? What's their primary motivations, objectives in getting into the land market? And I should say as well, we're talking here about owners that are acting with some kind of explicit environmental purpose, often alongside other things. So we're looking here specifically at environmentally oriented landowners. So we're not talking about things like agriculture and other things. And so against that, we then have a number of different sort of activities and motivations: rewilding, carbon offsetting, carbon insetting, which is similar to carbon offsetting, but it's basically where a landowner acquires land to generate carbon credits, not to sell on markets for revenue, but to offset their own emissions. So if it's a corporation, they can use that to offset their own corporate emissions and contribute to their own net zero targets. Commercial forestry, renewable energy, future natural capital opportunities. Again, this relates to what I was talking about a minute ago in relation to potential new natural capital markets mechanisms that might come online. We're seeing actors, sort of anticipating that just now. Ecotourism, property development, land value appreciation, tax benefits, and reputational benefits. And so what we end up with is this sort of matrix here, which probably doesn't display that well on the big screen. But you can see the type of landowner on the top and the different types of activities down the side. And we go through different case studies and sort of mapping this out a little bit more. And what we find is that for most landowners, they fit in at least one, but in practice, more than one of these different boxes here. So this is what we kind of end up with. I'm not going to go through all the different case studies here because we don't have time and we want to get into the discussion. So I appreciate that this probably doesn't mean that much, but it's basically a summation of all the different case studies that we go through and just an illustration of there are different types of actors here that are doing different types of things. I do want to just focus in on a couple of examples, though, just to shine a bit of light onto some of what's been happening. So if we take the example of Standard Life Investment Property Trust. So Standard Life, they acquired about 1,500 hectares of land in the Cairngorms for £7.5 million. And they said that its plans for tree planting and peatland restoration, it thinks will sequester just under 200,000 tonnes of carbon over the life cycle. And it expects that the bulk of the net costs of the tree planting will be met by grants. Now, the price it paid equates to just over £2,000 an acre for that land, and that is high, even for Scotland's land market. But if you look at it, which is partly what the company is doing, not just in terms of pounds per acre, but in terms of what price are they paying per tonne of carbon that they expect to offset, it thinks that it's getting a reasonably good deal. Because for the £7.5 million, when you divide that by the number of tonnes of carbon it expects to offset, it results at about £38 per tonne. Now, that's quite a bit higher than the prices we're seeing in the market today, which I said was about 15 to 20. But Standard Life and various others very much expect that price the price of purchasing offsets on the open market to increase quite dramatically in future. And so by buying that land today, they've basically locked in, or they think they've locked in, a fixed price for offsetting their carbon of £38 per tonne. And you can see here that if in future prices increase beyond that, then Standard Life has made a good decision because it's been a much more cost-effective way of, in its view, meeting its net zero targets. Of course, if prices stay below that, then actually it would have been more cost-effective to actually not buy land and actually just buy carbon credits in the open market as and when they need them. But basically, they're basically sort of speculating here on the future price of carbon, wagering that it will save costs over the long term by sort of getting this early mover advantage just now and locking in that fixed price for its offsetting. And it's worth just reinforcing here, this is an example of insetting. So they're not planning on selling carbon credits, they're planning very much on generating them to offset their own emissions. So that was just one example, and as I said, we go through other examples of other sort of asset managers, mass ownership model, individuals, and of course community ownership as well, just to get a sense of what's actually happening, the different actors, what are they doing on the ground, what's their sort of motivations and business models. And what we then do is we then say, well, how does this align with the principles of community wealth building? The Scottish Government has embraced community wealth building, as have various different local authorities across Scotland. And community wealth building is a sort of relatively new approach to local economic development, which aims to basically redirect and keep wealth circulating in the local economy, place ownership and control more in the hands of local people. Developed by the Democracy Collaborative in the US and the Centre for Local Economic Strategies in the UK. Community wealth building has sort of 5 key pillars, one of which, an important one, and I would say probably the most important one, is land ownership. And in the paper we basically sort of take the criteria up here, which are key sort of characteristics of what community wealth building tries to achieve, and we assess the extent to which the different models that we've looked at in the paper align with them or not. And so, in terms of criteria, community wealth building is being place-based, so having a loyalty to geographic place, developing local assets, including land, in ways that ensure that wealth stays local and is broadly shared. Local broad-based ownership, so important thing is minimising absentee ownership, ensuring that assets are broadly held and locally rooted over the long term so that income recirculates locally. Large local economic multipliers, so putting a high priority on local spending and investment to keep money circulating throughout the local economy, minimising that economic leakage, building that, creating and retaining wealth locally. Collaborative decision making, so ensuring that you have a wide range of stakeholders involved in decision making and not just either a single private owner or a government owner, including local residents, and putting a priority on delivering inclusive, well-paid jobs. And so, as I say in the paper, we sort of apply these criteria to the different case studies that we looked at. And again, this is a summary. It looks a bit, it's not going to tell you much because I can't go through all the different analysis and examples. But what we basically see is that out of all the models that we look at, community ownership is the most aligned with community wealth building principles because it is place-based. It delivers that sort of local broad-based ownership. There is some evidence that it delivers large economic multipliers. It's amber there because there's just a bit of lack of solid evidence on that. It obviously embodies collaborative decision-making and can deliver inclusive, well-paid jobs. And at the other end, we see the sort of absentee corporate and asset manager owners being the least aligned with community wealth building principles, which perhaps isn't really surprising. So just key conclusions then. So how land is owned and managed and governed is obviously going to be absolutely vital to whether we're going to be able to deliver a just transition to net zero. It's also, I think, the most important foundation upon which any community wealth building strategy rests. And I see, in the paper, we see community wealth building as being a sort of a key mechanism, a means to which a just transition to net zero can be delivered. At the moment, though, the way things are going, there is a significant risk that the financial rewards from Scotland's natural capital potential, which, as we talked about, could be quite significant depending on what happens in the future, will end up flowing to a relatively small number of landowners rather than generating that sort of inclusive prosperity for local communities. And there's a real sort of disconnect emerging between what's happening in the land market on the one hand just now and the Scottish Government's stated policy objectives around community wealth building, just transition, and also things like well-being economy as well. And so the key question then is obviously, well, what do we do? How do we sort of rectify that? And how do we sort of address that growing disconnect that's happening? And so we explored a number of different policy areas. I'm not going to go into them right now because we've got a discussion. But just to give a sort of a flavour, land market governance, talk about public interest tests, something which Community Land Scotland, Land Commission are also looking at. We sort of recommend quite a robust public interest test on existing landowners as well as at the point of sale. Scaling up public land acquisitions through things like the Crown Estate Scotland and Forestry Land Scotland. Regulation of carbon markets. So at the moment we have this voluntary approach to regulation of carbon markets. I think there's a real risk of greenwashing on a rather large scale, of being able to offset any kind of activity, including activity that can and should easily be reduced. And when we have the sight of obviously, big fossil fuel companies and things like that, being able to offset their emissions while continuing as business as usual, I think that's something that we really need to be addressed. Taxation, obviously a very powerful and important tool. How can we reform Scotland's tax system, not only to improve the function of the land market, but also capture some of that emerging value from carbon and natural capital, which can be used again to support public priorities and support local communities. Establishment of Community Wealth Fund, again harnessing some of that value that's being created and creating new ways to scale up and support community ownership and community-led initiatives across Scotland. Reforming public grants, making sure that public money that we're spending is only being used in ways that actually support and align our public policy objectives and not being spent on or not being allocated to things that actually can sometimes undermine them. Scaling up community ownership, obviously, but also other potential models that might be better aligned with community wealth building principles, better aligned than, say, absentee corporate ownership. Improving access to finance is another one. I mean, we talk a bit about the role of the Scottish National Investment Bank here. The Scottish National Investment Bank, actually, its largest investment to date was to Gresham House, which is a big forestry asset manager, £50 million. And so we think that, in actual fact, there are better ways that the Scottish National Investment Bank could be supporting our public policy objectives here, including supporting community-led initiatives, community ownership, and things like that. And finally, improving transparency in the land market, which I'm sure, as we all know, is a big barrier to what's happening. So I'm just going to stop there, I think, and yeah, hopefully that's been somewhat useful. I appreciate it's a big sort of run through. The paper is quite long and detailed, but we hope you enjoy it, and I hope it provides some sort of useful contribution to the debate. Thank you.